Hello everybody and welcome to the live stream. Thanks for joining me. Voice is a little bit croaky as you can hear, but thank you so much everybody who sent kind messages. I haven't been that ill, it's just basically the voice, and then I got flu, and then I thought I got over it before I had, and we went on a road trip, and that was a bit of a mistake with the AC and the everything else in the car. But anyway, here I am, and I think I'm 91.3% there in Formula One parlance, and looking forward to the weekend, Dutch Grand Prix. So thank you for, as I say, thank you for all of your kind messages. Sound like one of those ridiculous chat show hosts, don't I? So excuse me if I occasionally clear my throat. It's kind of weird thing that I think it's going to take a while to get absolutely 100%, but as I say, we are there. Well, I've got, obviously I'm going to try and get through as many questions as comments as I can, and comments as I can, as a normal with these live streams. I was going to check one thing, if I may, before we go any further. My usual drama, just want to make sure that it's looking, yeah, it's looking all right, isn't it? Good. Yeah, but I wanted to just talk a little bit about the Dutch Grand Prix before we get into it. And anyway, this isn't going to be a massively long live stream, because I just basically wanted to show my face and thank everybody and not put too much strain on the old vocal cords at this early stage of the weekend. Just sort of a test almost. Just speaking about the race this weekend, first of all, it's looks like it's going to be quite a lot of rain on all 3 days, which is unusual, isn't it, for a Grand Prix, any Grand Prix, anywhere in the world. Even the Dutch Grand Prix, you've had wet races, obviously, but to have all three kind of showing it's going to be wet, unprecedented. I wonder what they're going to do now, because they try to do all they can. I say they, the powers that be, try to do all they can to stop having wet races, but I don't think they're going to be able to do that this weekend. And we might actually see some real action on slippery bits of road surface, which will be brilliant. And we'll see. And there'll be wind too, I suspect, knowing Zandvoort coming off the coast there. So that'll make it interesting. The FIA have gone to quite a lot of trouble, or is it F1, I don't know, lose track these days, to try to make the race more exciting, on the basis that if it was a dry race, try and get a two-stop strategy instead of a one. Shock, horror, by increasing the speed limit from 60 to 80 kilometers an hour. That's good. But, you know, we shouldn't really be in the realms of having to do that and having to have two pit stops to make the race exciting and throw things around a little. Grand Prix racing should be able to do that on its own. But a little bit more about that when we get into the Grand Prix videos over the weekend. But here, let's just have a look at some of the history of Zandvoort, because it's going to be, I fear, the last Dutch Grand Prix. It's not on the calendar next year, and too small, too expensive to put on the race probably, and too many other circuits paying lots of money to be there as well. So it's kind of a shame this time round that Zandvoort isn't going to have a longer tenure on the championship. For me, it's one of the great Grand Prix circuits, not only because of its design, and it was very quick early on, but also because of the role it's played in the history of the sport and the number of things that have happened at Zandvoort. I mean, it's incredible. So I've selected some pictures here, and there are also some stories that I haven't actually selected pictures to talk around. But this is Prince Bira in his later years, actually. But he was always quick at Zandvoort and won the first big race at Zandvoort, held in 1948, actually staged by the BRDC, can you believe? All British drivers, apart from, well, including Bira, who raced under a British license, but of course he was a Thai prince, and his Maserati there, his Maserati raced in the blue and yellow colours of Thailand, and he won that race. Big dice with Tony Rolt. Peter Walker was quick too. But then in 83, amazingly, he came back to Zandvoort and did a few laps, and there he is in 83, just 2 years before he passed away of a heart attack. So Prince Bira is synonymous in the minds of many people with the history of Zandvoort. And the circuit was built obviously in the dunes adjacent to the sea, which was a big resort, obviously massive beaches there. But the beaches, of course, were commandeered by Hitler for World War II, and the big fortress was built on the edge of the beach, as they were all the way down to Normandy. And very, very impressively, I think, the Dutch motor racing fans, as soon as the war was over, used a lot of the debris from Hitler's wall to construct the main straight of the circuit. And obviously the tarmac today, completely different. But I think it's worth remembering as they thunder down that, I say thunder, it's not a very long straight anymore, sadly, but as they go down the main straight in front of the grandstand, that straight began and was built around all the remnants of the Hitler Wall of World War II, right on the coast there. Amazing, eh? And the circuit was designed by John Hugenholtz, who went on to design other great Grand Prix tracks, notably Suzuka, but also Jarama in Madrid, good example, and became the doyen of circuit organisers and also became part of the Dutch Grand Prix committee very early on. So a big tribute should always be paid to John Hugenholtz when we go to the Dutch Grand Prix. And then we had all these momentous things happening. Here's the start of the 52 Dutch Grand Prix, which was actually the first World Championship race to be held at Zandvoort. There's Alberto Ascari on the inside of Tarzan, a corner named after the farmer on the outside of that corner who was quite fierce looking, and everybody knew him long before the circuit was built as Tarzan, which is why they called the corner the Tarzan hairpin. So there's Ascari in the 52 Ferrari. He basically won everything that year and 53 down the inside, about to go on and win the 52 Dutch Grand Prix. But who's that next to him in that weird looking car? That is Mike Hawthorne in 1952 in the Cooper Bristol, right up there on the outside of Alberto Ascari. And this was a sort of a big moment for Mike Hawthorne, and not the first young British driver to use Zandvoort to stake his claim in Formula One's history. He was always quick. He was very, very good, and Zandvoort 52 was a very good example of that. So here's Graham Hill, another British driver, winning his first Grand Prix at Zandvoort in 1962. Also driving for BRM, driving for BRM, one went on to win the World Championship that year. But BRM also scored their first victory in the Dutch Grand Prix in 1959 in a car driven by Joe Bonnier, and he scored his one and only Grand Prix win at Zandvoort. So all these sort of weird firsts occurred at Zandvoort for strange reasons, different reasons all over the place. 61, find that one. 61, Taffy Von Trips, the Ferrari driver in the Sharknose Ferrari there, scored his first Grand Prix win in the Dutch Grand Prix, effectively beating his teammate Phil Hill, who's third there in the other Sharknose, sandwiching, would you believe, Tony Brooks in the BRM fitted with a Climax engine in 61 and going indecently quickly as a result, he says rather cynically. But Tony Brooks, very good that year, but Jim Clark actually finished third in that race and did extremely well. So, and now we fast forward to 1975, another British driver scores his first Grand Prix win at Zandvoort, and it's James Wallace Hunt, who does win for Hesketh in the Hesketh 308C, the only Grand Prix win for the Hesketh team, the private team run by Lord Hesketh. I think you got to count Walter Wolf Racing as another private team who went on to win, of course, with Jody Scheckter in 77, win Grand Prix, won their first Grand Prix. But James Hunt won Hesketh's one and only race and his first Grand Prix at Zandvoort in 75. A great win, and it's a little bit of a portent of what we might see this weekend, because the race started in the wet and James was there or thereabouts behind the two Ferraris driven by Niki Lauda, there on James's right, and Clay Regazzoni. But James did a really good call and came in quite early to switch to slicks. Now you could say, a classic undercut, but Niki Lauda thought the track was still sufficiently wet that he stayed out for 3 more laps. So that's how good James Hunt's call was and how good he was when he got onto slicks, when the track was obviously still pretty wet. And by the time Niki got out on slicks, James's tyres were right up to temperature, and he was in front of Niki and held off Niki for the rest of the race. And it was no easy thing. And James did what he later did in Canada in 76 so well against Patrick Depailler, used the traffic unbelievably well. Again, something that you would not do today, because the traffic is so regulated by GPS and by everything else. You can't impede another driver. But in those days, you could use the traffic well if you were good enough at it. And James was really good at putting back markers between himself and Nicky at really critical parts of the lap. And as a result, won that Grand Prix, his first win. The only the really sad thing was that Harvey Postlethwaite was there in qualifying. I was there for that race and saw the win. It was brilliant to be there. Harvey wasn't there because he'd gone back to Eastern Neston to the factory to prepare to do work on the car. And nor was Dave Beaky Sims, the number one mechanic, a very good friend of mine who'd been at Team Lotus. And he was back in England as well when James crossed the line. Can you believe it? Talk about irony after everything those guys all went through and the hard work they had. What about this? This is Jack Brabham on the grid in 1966 at Zandvoort. He's just turned 40 and he's winning Grand Prix, going very well in his own car with a Repco engine in the back. And he hobbled, a fake hobble to the car with a stick and with that beard on, and then went on to win the Grand Prix pretty impressively. And I've got, of course, there's half a chance that a certain other Australian might win the Dutch Grand Prix this weekend as well. But there's Jack in 66, when everyone was saying, how can somebody age 40 be that quick? Well, there you go, he was. 65 was a Jim Clark year in every sense of the way, and including in the Dutch Grand Prix. But this is the crowd outside the Haarlem courthouse on the Tuesday morning after the Dutch Grand Prix, waiting to see the outcome of the trial of Colin Chapman, the team owner of Lotus, would you believe? And what had happened, there was always a lot of police around the Dutch Grand Prix, very few officials. The whole thing seemed to be regulated by the police. 63, Jim Clark and Bruce McLaren were sort of thrown in a makeshift cell for standing and watching from the wrong position on the outside of Hansrijk while their cars were being worked on. Incredible. And in 65, Colin Chapman had his armband, first of the cool dudes, you got to say. He didn't have his armband on his arm, and his armband folded over his belt, as you did if you were super cool. And in the hustle before the race with all the people around the cars, Colin was sort of standing by the Lotus 33 of Jim Clark, and a policeman couldn't see the armband and manhandled him off the grid. And Hazel Chapman, Colin's wife, who was on the edge of the grid, sort of tried to tell the policeman to go away, and she got whacked in the face. Colin's shirt was torn, and then the race was run. Jim Clark won the race, and as Colin was running down to the car to celebrate, he was arrested and taken off to jail. So Jimmy spent most of the 65 Dutch Grand Prix celebration going to the local courthouse in Zandvoort, pleading for Colin's release, and it was not given. And he spent the night there, and then, as I say, by Tuesday he was moved to Haarlem, and eventually there were so many Formula One witnesses saying this was completely ridiculous, he should be released, that the judge sort of threw his hands up in horror and said, oh, there are too many witnesses here, we'll just stop the whole thing. They were the days, I suppose you could say, but imagine if that sort of thing happened today. Imagine the headlines that would be out there. Wet, I've talked about the fact that it could well be wet this weekend, so we had two brilliant wet. In recent times we've had wet as well, but two great Grand Prix victories in the wet at Zandvoort. One Jackie Stewart in 68. Look at those grooved Dunlop tyres on the Matra. That is a hand groove, and that was something that Dunlop were doing just to try, and it was a very innovative thing at the time to get the water to disperse from the tyres like that, and Jackie just disappeared. He did the same in the German Grand Prix that year in the wet. And he did when he won both races with his one of his wrists in a right wrist, I think, in a plaster cast following a shunt in the F2 race at Harama. As I say, another circuit designed by John Hugenholtz. How many dots are there to connect there? And here's another one, 71, Jackie Ickx in the Ferrari there, number 2, won in the wet. But Pedro Rodriguez was also really quick too in the BRM, the Yardley BRM there. That was a wonderful race too in the wet. Dutch Grand Prix. Finally, apropos nothing at all, Martin Tomlinson, an artist that we mentioned quite a lot on this live stream, has just completed this work of Jack Brabham. This is a 67 Brabham Repco, by which time they had the exhaust in the middle of the engine there. My favourite Brabham Repco, actually. Lovely painting. Thank you very much indeed for Martin. And I'll put details in the description after this in case you wanted to order a print or something like that. So, having said all of that, what else have I said? Oh, 61. I'd like to say 61 Dutch Grand Prix. There's two other firsts, actually, nothing to do with pictures now. 61 Dutch Grand Prix was the first race first championship race in which there were no retirements, Dutch Grand Prix, and also 68 Dutch Grand Prix, that wet race that Jackie Stewart won, was the first race in which a driver wore a full face helmet in the race. Dan Gurney in a Brabham. Actually, he'd run out of engines and borrowed a Brabham for that weekend in the Eagle. He was kind of fading the Eagle project out of Formula One anyway then, and it was his first race with the Bell Star helmet. And it had the visor was not opening either. It was a fixed visor, can you believe? Anyway, enough of all my stuff. I'm not going to spend that much time, so I'm going to get on to some questions now, if I may. And the first is, let's have a look if I can get all this sorted. The first is from, here we go, Sarosh Soman, and a regular, who says, "Hi Peter, hope you've recovered completely." Thank you very much, Sarosh. That's so kind of you to ask that and to wish that. I was about 90% there, as I say. And then he goes on to ask another question and says, Leclerc says he's not sensitive to vertical movements. Porpoising wasn't a problem for him at all. Says that he's more sensitive to the roll of the car. Your thoughts, please. Interesting. Did he say that? Wow. It explains why he went off in Baku that time, wasn't it? On old tyres and locked up. Car, obviously the nose dropped and he locked up, couldn't feel it, and crashed into the wall, so they came down the escape road. I don't know, it all sounds a bit complicated to me. Porpoising wasn't a problem. All I can say is Ferrari probably didn't have very bad porpoising then, because the whole point of porpoising is that the centre of pressure actually moves while you're braking. It doesn't just sort of stay in one position and then be different the next lap. It actually moves while you're driving the car. I can't imagine any driver would think that was a pleasant sensation. But anyway, I take it, with the pinch of salt with which it is said. Porpoising wasn't a problem. He says that he's more sensitive to roll. Well, I'm glad he's sensitive to roll, because that is all about weight transfer, and it's all about all the things we talk about when we're describing the things you need to be able to do incredibly well when you are creating shorter corners than other drivers out there. All those things, finding ways of managing the dynamic weight, and most of the weight that we talk about is lateral, or what does he call it here? Roll of the car. So yeah, I mean, he's not sensitive to vertical movements. I mean, there aren't that many vertical movements. It's just a question of pitch when you're braking and squat when you're accelerating. And obviously when you're going into a corner and you're braking while you're turning, which a guy like Leclerc does a lot, he's saying to himself, this is all about lateral load, and I'm trading off the lateral load so I don't get the understeer when it wants to be there. I'm getting the brake pedal pressure release exactly right, etc. And he's feeling it as lateral load, but indeed there will be some vertical load involved in that, because it's all to do with the nose going down as well. Not the nose not going down. I mean, there's very little movement, but it's all to do. There is weight transfer for sure between braking and acceleration. But interesting to hear that. Interesting that he can say that, and I wonder what in his own mind, what evidence he's using to say that. Whether he's doing it based on sim work or actually thinking about the way he drives the car. Interesting. Don't know really. Don't know what to say about that. Jez James says, "Hi Pete, hope you're better. Read Bravery. Nigel said in a Beyond the Grid interview, in my day around the old Silverstone circuit, you had to be so brave. Any thoughts?" Well, yes. I mean, Nigel's absolutely right. Of course, you had to be brave around Brands Hatch as well, and Cadwell Park in Formula 3, and Alton Park, and everywhere. Everywhere was more dangerous in the 80s than it is now. Everywhere was more dangerous in the 60s than it was in the 80s, and so it goes on. And I think Nigel is a very brave human being in and out of the car. If there's a difficult problem ahead, you want Nigel Mansell on your side. He's a brave guy. I've experienced it firsthand many times. But I still maintain, sorry about this, need to get rid of that. But I still maintain that Sterling Moss is absolutely correct. in driving a racing car on the absolute limit, if you're relying on bravery, you're not doing it correctly. It's all about anticipation and feel. And as much as Nigel will always like to feel, because he's a brave guy, he's a larger than life person, that he was quicker into Cops than Ricciardo because he's braver, or he was quicker than Prost into Club in the Ferrari in 1990 because he was more brave. As much as Nigel likes to think that, the reality is the only reason he was able to go through Club in the Ferrari the way he did, virtually flat, is because of the feel he had. Now, there may well have been a moment when his psyche said, whoa, but Nigel's feel would have allowed that to happen, and to go over that little edge. So it was never plunging into the unknown, which is what real bravery, I guess, is. It was, I know what's going to happen here because I can feel it. But Ricciardo, because he didn't feel the same things as Nigel, would have been plunging into the dark a little bit more than Nigel, and therefore would have required more bravery to do what Nigel did, and wouldn't have done it as well anyway. So again, I'm not sure racing drivers themselves are the right people to make that call, if you see what I mean. I'm not in any way being pretentious there, but I'm saying they are so involved with all the dynamic weight that's going on inside the racing car that they don't have time to be brave. And anyway, as Sterling always says, you shouldn't be brave to drive a racing car. It should all be about anticipation and feel. And I'd be willing to bet that every great Grand Prix driver has done their great things because of anticipation and feel and warning the car and knowing really what's going to happen next and manipulating the car than through sheer bravery. You'll get drivers who will be very brave in terms of braking or going over a blind hump at 165 miles an hour without lifting, not really knowing what's going to happen. But I can tell you this, if they have a moment coming out the other side, or worse, their survival instinct will then kick in and they will then back away the next lap. And that's what a Sterling Moss or a Michael Schumacher or a Max Verstappen or a Charles Leclerc or a Nigel Mansell will not do. They will never go into a position where they don't know what's going to happen next, to the point where the survival instinct has to kick in. What is the survival instinct? The survival instinct is, I'm quoting Rob Wilson here because I think he's absolutely right, no matter how many pints of beer you might swallow or glasses of whiskey you might drink, when you are wobbling on the edge of a cliff, there is still something inside you, a survival instinct, that stops you doing that thing of going over the cliff, unless you're completely blind drunk, of course. And it's that survival instinct, and it's the will to survive that we all have as human beings. And in racing, seemingly the cars are ridiculously fast, beyond the comprehension of 99% of the population, and therefore would require a lot of bravery to be driven the way they are. But as I say, it's not about bravery. It is about anticipation and feel and everything happening in slow motion, the same way it is when you're receiving serve from the fastest server in tennis and you think, how can he possibly get a return in there? It's because he's just focused on the center of the ball, and guess what? Everything is happening in slow motion, and the ball is as big as an orange, much bigger than a tennis ball. And that's so it is in racing. And if it wasn't, these guys wouldn't be able to do what they're doing. Now, some of them do make a lot of mistakes, and you'll see, I mean, a good example was the 73 British Grand Prix, when Ronnie Peterson in the Lotus 72 was just reflexes and balance and super quick. And Peter Revson was all management and Alan Prosty in the way he drove. And when the oil came down towards the end, it was Ronnie that had the big moment, recovered beautifully, but then on the next lap through, backed off a little. Whereas Peter Revson had a wider palette on which he could drive and operate, and just manipulated the car without losing a lot of speed, and won the Grand Prix and beat Ronnie. And that was a good example of that. So anyway, good one. Thank you. So Benzi's news shoe says, cool down, we're back. Brilliant. Benzi's Showdown, same guy. Thank you very much. Peter, do you have any Paddy McNally stories? He's been covered recently and entitled. the Fergie and Prince Andrew bio. Well, he was a very studious and detailed journalist for autosport, certainly in the late 60s, and then was married a wealthy lady who then passed away, and as a result of having a lot more money around him, I think he stopped his journalism quite abruptly, and quite early on went to work as either consultant or full-time with Philip Morris, doing quite a lot of stuff for them, and then became one of the key players of the Paddock Club when Bernie set up the Paddock Club. Paddy McNally was his guy, and to me, Paddy's always been a bit like Max Mosley, very charming when he wants to be very charming, but ice cold and pretty scary when you see another side of him. And so, without wanting to say too much else, that's about all I can say really. I never really got on that well with Paddy, and but I have total respect for his journalistic life at Autosport. And if you read through, I don't know, his report of 69 Daytona 24 hours, it's incredible. The detail, the gearbox changes, the camshaft profiles, the types of compound tyre they were running. He was right there, really good. And he did some pretty good track testing as well. So there you go. Kelly J, glad you're feeling well, Peter. Thank you very much. I've been an American Formula One fan since the 80s and have been a fan of yours for many years. Thanks for your stories and insights. Oh, thank you very much, Kelly. My question from Kelly, would you be willing to tell us what went wrong with the US One? Seems to have so much promise and got so close. Well, actually, I think it was the last thing I spoke about before got my laryngitis, so I better not tempt fate too much, but suffice to say that it was a great idea. I still believe it was a great idea and it would have done very well, but it was such a great idea that Bernie and Max adopted it as a sort of way to create a new Formula One championship within a championship, which they called the budget cap championship. And Bernie wanted to do that because he was trying to get Ferrari and McLaren and Williams to sign a new Concord agreement. And one of the bits of leverage he wanted to create was, we don't need you guys, we've already got a new championship and it's going to be for new teams that can operate on a much smaller budget, much more interesting, blah, blah, blah. And so that's why he created that championship. And just to give you one little cameo of what was going on, there was a moment quite early on in the life of USF1 when Bernie rang me to say, Peter, I've got Luca Montezemolo on the other line. Luca, tell Peter what you've just told me. And Luca came on the line and said, Peter, we love the concept of USF1, building the car in America, racing it in Europe, and Ferrari would like to provide engines for you because this is such a great project for Ferrari North America to get behind, which was brilliant. And we also had the same offer more or less from Toyota. And then about 6 weeks later, I got a phone call from Bernie saying, Peter, forget the Ferrari thing. Everybody's going to run Cosworth engines. Want the deposit by next week? Be £7 million deposit, and you've all got to run Cosworth engines. You'll have lots of revs. You'll have much less rear wing than the other teams in the old category of Formula One. It's a new championship. Can't have your entry yet. We're going to open it up now to 8 or 9 other new teams, and we'll do the bidding in September, October. This was like March, April, in what was it, 2009. And so we had to wait sort of 9 months, and then we were given our entry in around sort of August, September, and then we were told we had to have the car running for the first round of the World Championship the following season, and we hadn't built the factory, let alone built and designed the car or done anything, because we couldn't do anything until we were signed into the Concord Agreement. Back to Sarosh. Hi Peter, last question. In your opinion, was Michael slow when he returned, or was he still the same, but since the car wasn't fast, his good performance wasn't visible? No, I think he was slower than he had been as a racing driver. And because he wasn't quite as sharp, all the other things piled up on him. Nico Rosberg getting better and better. A new era in terms of a lot of the technology going on in the cockpit. And kind of, the whole Sebastian Vettel, Lewis Hamilton syndrome when they went to Ferrari of, multi-world champion, not much I need to learn anymore about driving. And I think Michael was in the same situation. He just couldn't work out why it wasn't, he wasn't dominating Nico basically and going faster. So I don't think he should ever have come back because he had such a great career at Ferrari, and all those things I don't think he ever really realised. His best performance was Monaco, wasn't it? When he should have been on the pole, but he had some sort of penalty, I think, or something like that. But it was never convincing. More convincing than Jody Scheckter's last year at Ferrari, though. I've got to say that. In 1980, he was absolutely nowhere. Anyway, this is from Diego Moreno from Madrid. Hey, Diego, how you doing, buddy? I want to ask your opinion on this. In Mexico, they're trying to sell the idea that only a few great drivers have charisma. Fangio, Senna, Schumacher, and Checo. Sorry, I'm choking on my water there. Yeah. What do you think yourself about this? Having worked with all these drivers, what do you define as charisma? Well, of course, I never worked with Fangio. Never even saw Fangio drive. And never worked with Senna. Really, I did as a journalist, I did, and spoke to him a lot in his early days and in Formula One too, but knew Michael reasonably well. In terms of charisma, I think it's an indefinable, by which I genuinely mean indefinable. I think it's a bit like the soul of a human being. What is the soul? How do you describe it? It is the way you think of that person without the physicality of the person. It is who they are. It is what they are. And then you can have your own interpretation of that. But I think charisma is a little bit like that, isn't it? For a start, it's very subjective. So it's how you perceive a person. And secondly, it is indefinable things that nicely can't be put into words and ruined by people trying to describe these things with words. The fact that we can't put this into words, I think, is a very nice thing. And so Fangio, charisma, of course he had charisma, but part of his charisma was, for us English speaking Formula One fans, that was him not really speaking any English, and that was very charismatic in my opinion. He was enigmatic, and because he was enigmatic, he was charismatic. And then he had this genius of the way he could drive the car, seemingly at will and in any way he wanted to, on any circuit of the world. And that is charisma in itself, because you can't really explain that any more than he could explain it. So there's your charisma for Fangio. For Senna, people say that he was probably the epitome of charisma. For me, I always felt that I was in the presence of somebody very, very good, who was absolutely on it in terms of everything that Formula One or motor racing in general was all about. And so at the time, did I think of him as being charismatic? No, I just thought of him as, wow, that's Ayrton Senna. He's unbelievably good. And you could say, well, he'd walk into a restaurant and all the heads would turn. Well, of course they would, because he was a very good racing driver. And I suppose that's another example of charisma. If I look back now, yes, of course he was charismatic. And I suppose in saying that, I'm beginning to say it has to be something that's unique to that person that nobody else on the planet has. And that's pretty difficult to define as well, isn't it? But Ayrton had that in the way he was, his body language and the way he sat in the car and the way he talked about it, and his ability to think beyond racing. And I've told this story many times, but when I asked him why with a manual gearbox, H-pattern gearbox, he would always go down through every gear to a hairpin from top gear, instead of jumping gears as everybody else did. At some point you jump from fourth to second, or I don't know, third to first. He always went through every gear religiously. And I said, why? And he said, well, because I just can't do that. My body won't allow me to miss a gear. It would be like playing the wrong note on a piano. And that's charismatic, I guess, because how many other racing drivers think and thought that way? I think some did, but they just didn't put it into the same words. Schumacher, well, he generated, a bit like Fangio, he created his own charisma by not talking very much. The minute Schumacher did his deal with the German TV station that paid him a lot of money to do interviews only with them, and then begrudgingly everybody else got 30 seconds, but sort of 10 minutes with them after every session and after every race. The minute that happened, and you knew you were never going to get anything out of Michael because you only had him for 3 seconds, that became charisma in its own way, because it became a bit of a mystery. And then the British press would build up the Michael versus Damon thing, and that made him charismatic in a sort of negative way, bigger than his own persona. It's all these things that you imagine going on, but in reality, of course, they're just ordinary people. Well, most of them are like you and I. They go home and they read books and magazines or watch TV or do whatever they do, and they probably look at themselves in a normal way at that moment. But when they're out in their own environment, the racing environment, they're thinking, "Wow, is that really me there on that poster there?" And I suppose in a way they try to understand what charisma is all about. I think that's where Jim Clark was so good, because he never really thought about any of that stuff or cared about it. And when he wasn't in a race car, he was either helping the mechanics make the tea, or making tea for the mechanics, or talking to Colin, or thinking about aircraft and herding sheep. He was never thinking, wow, I'm Jim Clark on the world stage. Brand, the Jim Clark brand. He was never thinking that way. And as for Checo, well, in his own way, he's got his own charisma. But I would, if you wanted to talk Mexican drivers, I would say Pedro and Ricardo Rodriguez had charisma in bucket loads, whereas Perez is, he's got a huge following in Mexico. Does that add up to charisma? Charisma has to be, I suppose, now I'm again thinking about it, has to be sort of unanswered and unexplainable things. Like, we never really understood why Pedro was so good in the wet but not that good in the dry, or why Ricardo was so good at such a young age. All these things. Checo, are there any sort of unanswered questions about Checo? To my mind, not really. Just, he's very good on the back end, traction. He's, created an amazing career for himself, and now he's rebooting it with his Cadillac thing. But I wouldn't have said he's a particularly charismatic driver in the way of Fangio or Senna. That is for sure. Gracias y feliz tarde. Thank you very much, Diego. Philip Anderson. Hi, Peter. My comment disappeared, I think. What do you... Yes, it probably did. Sorry about it. I'm just going to get up now. It's got a bit darker. I'm just going to turn the lighting down. It's a bit bright. 1 second. There we go. That's better. All right, I'll focus now. Good. So this one is Philip Anderson. Hi, Peter. My comment disappeared, I think. What are your thoughts on qualifying race engine mode rules? Because it looks like those are and can be altered from the pit wall. Well, they can be. You can play with various aspects of the engine, not from the pit wall. You give an instruction to the driver to go into, strat this or whatever. And So in that sense, it's kind of controlled from the pit wall. It's not left to the driver to do that, but it's not remotely controlled in the way it used to be in Formula One. Of course, they have all the technology to do that, and they banned that. Max banned that. The whole idea of driver aids mustn't make it too easy for the drivers. So now the teams have to do it and make it easy for the drivers. So, and qualifying to the race, everybody's in the same situation, really. They all kind of go a little bit quicker in qualifying, and in the race mode, you can have, if it's wet, they'll have a different mode in the race for the engine than if it's dry, and so forth. Which is all okay. I mean, it's a good example of modern technology and what these guys can do, I think, with their engines. Another question from Phil. Do you think Parc Fermé rules are still fit for purpose in the modern Formula One with the cost cap? That's a good point. Well, I think we need a Parc Fermé, and I mean that's clear. We need a Parc Fermé. What you're probably getting at is whether or not you can make changes according to the weather. I imagine that's what you're getting at, and I'm not. I think it's better for everybody if that gamble is taken out and everybody can set the car up for the wet or the dry or whatever they want to do. And so I think that is the case. You are allowed to do certain things if it's wet, but even with the current Parc Fermé rules, but it's not enough, obviously. And so I think that needs to be looked at myself. But in general, I'm a guy that I lived through the era when they did the weight checks on the cars after qualifying, and there was plenty of time to put a different rear wing on the car to make sure it passed the test. And so I'm glad that we don't have that anymore, and they go into Parc Fermé before qualifying. That makes a lot more sense to me, and I think that's an important thing, because I'm not saying would anybody cheat in Formula One? No, of course not, but just to make sure, it would make some sense, wouldn't it? So yeah, Parc Fermé. It's a bit annoying, the whole Parc Fermé thing. I mean, that business of was it Lewis touching Max's wing or Max's touching Lewis's wing or something at Brazil, wasn't it? All that's a bit over the top, but equally, you've got to have some sort of policing system, and it's not a bad system, to be honest. Fuzzy 22. Speaking of Fuzzy 22, Fuzzy Zeller, one of my favourite golfers, makes me think of golf, and my mate Alex Del Rey, who's currently leading the Swiss, I think it's the Swiss Masters in Crans-Montagna in Switzerland. When we started this, there were still 8 holes to play, so a long way to go yet. But go for it, Alex. I can't believe it. He's already won once this year. Good on him. Fuzzy22 says, "Hi, Peter. Hope you're feeling better." Yeah, well, thank you very much. I am. What do you think about Nigel Mansell mortgaging his house to continue racing? Have other drivers done similar things? Well, yeah, I mean, I was there when he was doing all that, and that was 98. Was it 98? I'm getting all my years. No, 80. What am I talking about? That was 1978. And he remortgaged his house and got some money out of it. And with that, he gave that money to March for 5 races. I think it was 30 grand, something like that, 20 maybe. And Formula 3, factory March, works car, nothing on it, bright red. And the money ran out, and that was it. March said, right, thank you very much. And got somebody else in the car. This is Nigel Mansell, who went on to win the World Championship, as we know. And he didn't race again that year. And that was the year I met Nigel. And he'd just done, he was doing his first race with that money. And so I went to all those races, and then the money ran out. And I spent the rest of that year basically helping him as much as I could to raise money and writing letters. And the real salvation came from David Price, wonderful man, great team owner, Formula 3 owner, team owner, who saw the talent in Nigel, and he had a sponsor, Unipart. He had free Triumph Dolomite engines, which were useless. But anyway, it was a free drive, and Nigel drove for him throughout 79. It was all midfield stuff, but he was still very impressive to watch that year. But it was that year, 78, when I met him, and his determination and self-belief in the second half of 78 instilled in me certainly the belief that this guy was definitely going to make it, and we were going to find the money, and we were going to get into Formula One, and he did it. And his wife Roseanne backed him all the way as well. That was in Hall Green, Birmingham. Had a little cottage there that they remortgaged. Luca Veronese, sorry. Hi there, Luca. Thank you very much. Hi, Peter. Hope you're feeling better. Thanks for sharing your knowledge. All the best from the UK. Thank you very much. M.A. Khan, another regular. Study of braking points over a race found Max makes more adjustments each lap than any driver followed by Leclerc. These are often small changes each lap. Is this linked to short corners? Well, it's linked to short corners in that he's constantly playing with the brake balance, brake bias, whatever you want to call it, because he's always turning in on the brakes to some extent. Most corners anyway, I'd say 80% of the corners of any given circuit. He's always braking to his rotation point. He's not thinking braking in a straight line and then loading up the car. He's thinking extend the straight as long as I can, start to turn the wheel, I'm still flat, now I'm going to have to start braking, I've got steering load in the car and I've got to get this car stopped. And as I've said many times, every corner is different, the track is changing every lap, and the way he and every other human being on the planet Earth applies the brake pedal pressure is slightly different every corner and every lap. Everything is different. And so he's constantly adjusting everything. He's constantly playing with the footwork. That's the most important thing in terms of getting the front of the car in to the point where it's not understeering, and he's extending the straight for as long as he can, and then he's coming out of the brake pedal pressure at exactly the right rate to get to rotation. And everything that he's feeling that isn't quite right, he will then adjust with the brake balance as he's going through the race. That's what he's doing, as will Leclerc, as will Lewis at his peak, if he's doing what he should be doing and isn't doing now, and used to do, obviously, in the Mercedes days. So that's why he's doing that. It's one of the things that he can play with that's relatively easy to, not easy, it's a logical thing from being able to put into everything else he's doing. He can obviously affect the balance of the car and the weight distribution and the weight transfer of the car with the way he's using the pedals and using the steering, but as an additional thing he can throw in brake balance as well. So, and M.A. Khan says, I've seen from data from 0506 regarding apex speed of drivers, Schumacher was never in the top 8. He always gained speed on entry and exit. Please explain. Does this mean he's using a V-line? Well, no, not using a V-line. It's what I've always said about drivers like Michael, like Max, like Charles, like Lewis when he was doing it, like Nigel, like Carlos Reutemann, like Sterling Moss, like Jim Clark. All the drivers who have that ability to shorten a corner do not care about minimum speed. Their speed is gained by extending the straight going into the corner. The rotation point is defined by the least possible downside for having to put all that nasty lateral load through the car, getting the car pointed as straight as they possibly can with exactly the right amount of steering load, and then getting the car to accelerate as early as possible, extending the next straight as much as they possibly can into the corner. So the one thing they don't care about is whether or not they're 3 or 4 miles an hour quicker than somebody else in the middle of the corner at their rotation point. The only thing they care about is how quickly they're going in and how quickly they can get the car straight and accelerating again. Their perception of the racetrack is this racetrack is all straights joined by corners. It's not lots of corners with straights in between. So they're trying to maximize the straights all the time. And so for them, it's completely irrelevant what they're doing. All they're doing is rotating the car at the point of the least possible downside. And of course that's going to be quite slow compared with a Liam Lawson or a Carlos Sainz or a Ronnie Peterson, who's going to brake really late in a straight line and then get on the power as soon as they can. And by the time they get to the apex, they've got half throttle on, and yeah, he's probably going much quicker than Max Verstappen would there, or Michael Schumacher. But Michael and Max have picked up so much speed while they've been sort of waiting to get on the power on the left rear. Here we go. So that just confirms everything I say. You know, it is all about It's not about minimum corner speed. So whenever you see those graphics coming up, ignore them. They're irrelevant. They may be relevant amongst all the drivers of the same style, comparing, say, Lawson with Sainz. That would be a good comparison. But not comparing Lawson with Max Verstappen, mid-corner. He's probably quicker than Max in the middle of most corners, I would think. I'm going to be all right, don't worry. Right. Alessandro Durango. Hi, Peter. I assume that the 26 power units will be closely tied to their fuels. How will that work with customer teams? Could this potentially lead to conflicts with existing sponsorship agreements? Now, I think you'll find now that even teams that carry branding contrary to the oil fuel branding of the mother team, if that's the right word, run actually the liquid from the mother team and it's just rebranded. That's my knowledge of how it works. I don't think any of the customer teams run fuel and oil that are different from the master teams, and it'll be the same in 26. Khalil Hassan. It's a little bit like what was it like? It was like Michael Schumacher doing his deal with Nike, but still using Sparko shoes with Nike logos. Because he liked the Sparko shoes. I'm sure it applies to most golfers as well, doesn't it? Amy Newland, glad you're recovering. We'll listen however long you can manage. Thank you very much. And Khalil Hassan, hello Peter, been a while, big fan from Syria. Thank you very much. Wow, all these people all over the world, just so kind. Thank you. Sergio Alvarez Sanchez. Hi Peter, do you feel that the Cadillac lineup with 2 seasoned drivers is the right route to take at this stage for them? No, I don't. I think there aren't many opportunities for any race team to run 2 young guys and groom them and let them grow organically with a team. But if there is a time, it's in the first year in Formula One. That's exactly when you can afford to have 2 young guys. Under the heading of, the history shows that Grand Prix drivers with great experience have no ability whatsoever to be able to bring that experience to any new team for which they happen to work. Good example, Felipe Massa, Rubens Barrichello leaving Ferrari and not being able to do anything with that experience by the time they got to Williams. Just 2 examples. Then why wouldn't Cadillac, for one, run a young American driver, American team, American driver, bring him on, they've got a year. He hasn't done enough testing, and we couldn't run somebody like Carl Kirkwood or Colton Herta because they'd need to have a couple of years. It's all rubbish. Put them in the car. There's your testing. Year 1, nobody's expecting any from the team anyway. What is the problem? And then the other driver needs to be some young hotshot. My choice would be somebody like Frederick Vesti, but there are plenty of others. And I think it's very disappointing that they've gone this route in the belief that 2 seasoned drivers, what are they going to do? They're going to say, oh yeah, got understeered, oversteered, poor traction, not quick enough on the straight. Well, how do we fix it, Valtteri? Well, you can get a softer rear, get better traction. Yeah, but what happens to the end of the front? Well, talk to Checo. And so it'll go on. It's just ridiculous. It's much better to have 2 guys come in with no preconceived experience whatsoever and grow with the team. I don't know what they're thinking. Such a shame. That, as I say, that opportunity doesn't come along very often. And here it is. I mean, you could say, well, at least with Checo, they're going to get a lot of money from Mexico, and that's great for a new team. But I thought this team had $750 million anyway. I thought it was all backed by some unbelievable bank that's got limitless money. Why do they need to go to Checo to bring some Mexican sponsorship into the team? That's not a great sign, is it? Why, they should be full of great American corporate sponsors with an American driver in the car. And around that young American driver, they could either create a driver challenge, great for television, wonderful reality TV, a bit like the thing Red Bull tried to do. It didn't work, did it? Because Scott Speed was their winner, but I think the judging panel was not particularly on song at that moment, was it? But you could do that again, even if you know who the winner's going to be. You could nonetheless do some great reality TV around that and create massive interest around the whole team. And which young American's going to get to do it? And it could be a girl. Why not take a risk, do some stuff that's interesting. There are plenty of good young people out there. and yet they're not doing it. Perez and Bottas. Nothing against either of those two drivers per se. Very good racing drivers, very good midfield journeyman racing drivers, quite capable still probably of winning a Grand Prix if they were in a McLaren, but not the people you want, I think, in my opinion, at Cadillac. Such a shame. Such a shame. CACMaster 69. Are you a fan of MotoGP, Mr. Windsor? Or Peter, actually. Well, it says Windsor, but anyway, I think you mean Peter. I used to be called Windsor at school. Windsor, what are you doing? If so, you'll be aware of Marc Marquez's dominance in low grip conditions. Is there any Formula One driver who has such a superiority, particularly in low grip conditions? You mean the rain? And of course, any driver who's good enough to create very good short corner laps of any circuit, or to get the weight transfer absolutely right when it's change of direction, or just to find a little way of getting the car to put its power down really well. All those sorts of drivers are going to be good in the wet, because the wet it just magnifies faults, really. If you've got a fault and you're always a bit clumsy on the brake pedal and you brake as late as you can very harshly, the problem with that may not show up on a high grip dry circuit on soft tires, but it'll show up in the wet on most racetracks. And that's the beauty of the wet. It shows mistakes, and it rewards perfection and suppleness and softness. And that's the beauty of racing in the rain, in my opinion. And hopefully we'll see some of that this weekend at Zandvoort. I mean, if you think about Zandvoort, I mean, it's the opposite to the way John Hugenholtz created it. He wanted a long straight, lots of fast corners, no more than one slow corner. And we've got the opposite, really. Oh, that's right, and very little banking on the corners. So we've got two heavily banked corners, got lots of slow corners, pretty short straight to the point where it's impossible to overtake, even with two DRS zones. McLaren will have a downforce advantage, which will show itself on the medium slow corners, and the slow corners in traction, probably, more than turn-in, I would think. And of the two, I think Lando will probably do a slightly better job. But it will even it up a little bit. A guy like Max, if he doesn't have a great Red Bull, if he's got 2 days actually to set it up in the wet, I think he'll probably get the car to be pretty good, and he'll be quite quick. If it's genuinely wet on all 3 days, Max should be right there, I think, because he's that good in terms of finding the grip, not worrying about the racing line at all, not worrying about his minimum speeds, just doing everything right, maximizing everything that he can do with the car in terms of extending the straights. And he'll be doing that beautifully. George obviously will be his usual, incredibly forceful self, and will be quick, no doubt. Mercedes will be quick, in my opinion, there. And Ferrari, watch out for Charles. I mean, all these things should suit Lewis perfectly as well. Lots of sort of technical slow corners where he can really become Lewis Hamilton again, and lots of places where there's no way Charles can really do anything different to Lewis, the bank corners, for example. And they're going to have a lot of downforce on the car. So I'm not saying he needs that, but I mean, it's all good stuff for Lewis. So he should be right there. And if he's not there, then I've said this in the last race, really. So but we've had the break. So in theory, something might have changed. He should be right there, I think. Legenga Eugene. Hello, Peter. Assume it's the final round of the championship. 3 drivers are tied on points. And you're asked to pick one driver to start on pole and win the championship. Assuming overtaking will be difficult, who would you pick? Hamilton, Max, Charles, and Vettel in his prime. Max, I think. Max out of that lot. Yeah. I mean, we don't know what car they're in. Is it Max in a Red Bull, Lewis in the best Merc, so forth, good Red Bull? You can't really... it's got a bit bright again, isn't it? I'll tell you, I'm going to change another light. 1 second, I'm quite fanatic about this now. See how bad it is. been a while since I've got slightly different lights now. I've got slightly different lights now, and they're adjustable, which is good, but not really responding, are they? Yeah, I'd go for Max, I think, on that one. Legenga Eugene again. Hi, Peter. Based on in-depth synthesis and analysis, who do you think will win the championship between Lando and Oscar? Well, I wouldn't make a decision based on in-depth synthesis and analysis, because I don't know what that is really. My gut feeling is about all I can talk about, is that it'll go to Lando, but it's not to say that I don't think Oscar's capable of winning the championship. Of course he is. I mean, right now he's ahead on wins, isn't he? And he's ahead on points. So Oscar, yeah, it'll be interesting, because I mean, basically Oscar, if Lando's having a good weekend, providing Oscar continues, I think he's finished every race this year, isn't he? If he's continuing to be there, just scoring good points and mitigating the damage, limiting the damage, he's going to have his day too when he's going to win Grand Prix, and that will be the philosophy, I think, is not to panic if there's a day when Lando, for whatever reason, has got the race, but just stay with it. Because I think they'll be thinking, because on the days when Oscar's going to be winning Grand Prix, and there'll be plenty of those coming up, Lando doesn't do as well as Oscar in finishing a very close second, an easy second. He gets involved in dramas. I think that's what they kind of think. That's what they should be thinking, probably. And in that way, Oscar's going. But I mean, just gut feeling, as I say, to me, it's Lando. Still not happy with the lighting, but I'm not going to faff around with it any longer. And same gentleman, Legenga Eugene. Hi, Peter. Some argue that winning one championship with Ferrari is worth more than winning 8 with Mercedes or Red Bull. What do you have to say about this? Well, it depends on circumstances and the era and who the driver is and what he's done before. If you look at Fangio's history, the year that's kind of spoken of least actually is his year when he won with Ferrari in '56, partly because the win came courtesy of Peter Collins. I think Fangio would have won it anyway, to be fair, but that was the famous race when Peter Collins gave his car, who was still in the running for the World Championship, gave his car to Fangio, saying, I couldn't imagine anybody but Fangio winning the championship, both Ferrari drivers. And Fangio won that championship. And Fangio always made it clear that he was never really comfortable at Ferrari and never really liked that year very much and wanted to get straight back to Maserati. So in that sense, Fangio proves the lie of what you've said there. What you're trying to say, I think, is, you know, if Lewis can win a championship at Ferrari, it'll mean a lot more than all the championships he's won at Mercedes and McLaren. And in that sense, it might, because he's had to go there and beat an incumbent Charles Leclerc and done it, and beaten Leclerc. And if he does that, you could argue that is his greatest achievement. In fact, I would argue that. That's why I don't think it'll happen, because I don't think he'll beat Leclerc to a championship, even if the Ferrari's really, really good, because Leclerc's that good. But I think that's why people may be saying that, you know? And they're saying it because, to the background of that, Sebastian Vettel went from his 4 Red Bull titles and couldn't win a championship at Ferrari. So if Lewis can do it, that shows up how good he is. So I think that's what it means, really. But if you take it in the context of reality, look at Fangio's 56 season, you know, not his greatest year. Guy Hammersley, good to have you back on screen, Mr. Windsor. I hope you're feeling much better. Thank you very much, yeah. I'm feeling a bit ghost-like, that's all. I'm slightly worrying, but I hope it's not real me. It's just the lighting. I'll get it sorted. Blade Bowman, hi Peter, I'd love to know Jackie Stewart's opinion on the modern 2-pedal cars versus the traditional 3-pedal with a foot clutch, as far as driving techniques, advantages, etc. Yeah, I have actually asked him about that quite a lot, and he, without in any way wanting to sound like somebody reminiscing or wishing or saying that his days were better days, he says it's kind of sad that the whole business of having to have perfect up and down shifts on an H-pattern gearbox, manual gearbox, has completely disappeared from the art of being a Grand Prix driver. And I think he's right. Yeah, we wouldn't need DRS if we had manual gearboxes, because one of the ways you passed people in the old days was to push him so hard that he missed a gear and you out-accelerated them out of the corner. That never happens now. And so that whole thing is gone, and that's a shame. And so we just don't know. You know, if people want to compare Michael or Max or Lewis to Fangio or Ascari or Michael, no, not Michael, it's a bad example, anybody pre-sequential, then we can't do it, because we just don't know how good or bad Max's gear changing would have been. Probably would have been sublime, but we don't know, do we? We don't know for sure. Any more than we know how Fangio would have driven had he had paddle shift. Sounds odd, doesn't it? We just don't know what he would have thought of it. I mean, when the first time Ayrton drove it, he loved the idea, the concept of both hands being on the wheel all the time and using the paddle shift. But I don't ever remember Fangio saying, or reading about Fangio saying, "Oh, it's terrible, I have to keep taking my hand off the steering wheel to change gear. Sometimes in the left, sometimes on the right. Can't drive the car." Never occurred to him, I think. They just did it. The best one was Dan Gurney, who I asked him once why he never had his hands in the approved 10-2 position on the steering wheel, like that. He always had one hand down, like that, on the straight. And he said, "Oh, so I'll be ready. And it depended on what the next corner was. I wanted to make sure I was ready with the opposite lock." You know, you don't have to worry about that these days, do you? Anyway, good question. Thank you very much. So this one is, let's get back. I missed that one. Where are we? Did Formula One speak up? This is from Tommy Bola Bola. Did Formula One speak up about apartheid at the time in South Africa? Were the drivers back in the day using their platform to address injustice, violence, human rights violation and such? Thank you. Not to talk about it, but they set examples, and I think that's all you can do if you're a public figure, an athlete. You're not out there to be asked to make speeches, but you are making examples. And when we used to go to South Africa in the early days, I can remember many drivers always being incredibly nice and trying to do all they can to show the equality of human existence. And I think that's, you know, Formula One drivers in general have always done that very well. Sport in general, I think, have done that. Harvin Gwyn Windsor, thank you very much. Harvin Gwyn says, "Great athletes slow the game down. It comes to them. They don't chase." Well, exactly right. That's what I'm saying. Watching it all and feeling it in slow motion. If it's not happening and it's all in a rush and you're driving on reflexes and you've got to be brave, it's going to end in disaster. Believe me. Lazy Tim. Recently watched a video about Jack Brabham. I didn't realise he'd done so much and been so successful. Did you ever meet the man? I did. And I saw him drive many times. And I was absolute fan of Jack's, and asked him many questions that I always wanted answers to, and he was just fabulous, great. And you're absolutely right. I mean, he had charisma. Talk about charisma. Black Jack Brabham had charisma of his own. Very different from Mike Hawthorne, very different from Dan Gurney, very different from Jackie Hicks, different from Denny Hulme even, but he had charisma in spades, and he was the pioneer. He was the first driver. Well, Jack did so many things. I still believe that the Climax engine, which went on to win the World Championship for Cooper and Jack in 59 and 60, and then for a number of British teams thereafter, would not have had the career it had, the Commentary Climax Formula One company, without Jack Brabham's inertia and feedback and momentum. Jack played a big role in the whole Coventry Climax era. The gearbox on the Cooper as well, which is VW based, a lot of that was Jack. And then he won his 2 world championships with Cooper. And then almost immediately he was thinking, right, do my own team, got to do my own thing with Ron Toronac. And did. And was very good. He won Grand Prix with the Climax engine in the Brabham, and then started thinking about doing his own engine with Repco in Australia, based on a Buick V8 engine. And he played a huge role in that. Got John Judd from Climax over to join Repco, and he was his man at Repco when that engine was being designed and built. And they built this car, and they won the World Championship in 66 and 67. And in 67, his teammate won it, Denny Hulme, and Jack never complained. And then 1970 with the Cosworth engine, he was as fast as anybody out there, age 44, as quick as Stewart and Rindt. Incredible racing driver, incredible driver engineer, and pretty good on one-liners. Very funny guy, and a perfectionist in some ways. Why wouldn't he be? But the greatest thing of all that I always respected about Jack was that he retired at the end of 70, still at his driving peak, because his family wanted him back in Australia where they were. And I remember doing an interview with him at his original Esso garage in Surrey, which had become Jet, I think, Jet Fuel, but JET, it's an English brand, quite an old English brand of fuel. Maybe it was still Esso then, I don't know, but it's a Jet garage now anyway. And he met me out the back of the office, and we chatted for a couple of hours, and he said, and I better not do the accent because people get upset these days with the accent, but he said, you know, the most irritating thing was that he retired at the end of 70, go back to Australia, and 1 year later, 71, his eldest son Jeff said, "Hey Dad, I want to go motor racing," and Jack went all the way back to Europe with him, by which time he'd sold Brabham and Bernie Ecclestone had bought it. And he was sort of on the fringe thereafter, and I thought that was terribly sad. Bernie never really used him as any sort of ambassador or anything like that, and it was just Jack doing his own thing. And Jeff was very good, Gary was very good, David obviously very, very good as well. But Jack was always a little bit on the side. But to me, one of the great racing drivers, and very, very astute. Amazing driver. Thanks for asking that question. Easy G, man like Benzie, James, Easy G, James, and I think it's all clapping amongst yourselves, I think. There you go. Easy G, get FP1 in my veins. Oh, there you go. Extreme BHP, hi Peter, thank you for a great show. People don't talk about Niki Lauda enough. I think that he was so methodical while racing for Ferrari. Such a pity he didn't race the BT46B longer. Yeah, he was. I mean, as I think I showed earlier on when James won that race in 75, and that was obviously before Niki's accident. Niki wasn't that good in the wet, I don't think. And then after accident, the Japanese Grand Prix, he was still in the running for the championship. You know, he's the guy that didn't race at Suzuka, and James got the championship. A lot of people say, well, you know, it was Niki, the accident, understandable. But if you look at what happened, for example, Zandvoort 75, took him 3 laps longer than James to come in for slicks, because he was just a little bit, you know. Having said that, you know, the championship was going pretty much Niki's way, so I didn't want to take any risks. Yeah, but I saw Niki on the absolute limit in a March Formula 2 car, Mallory Park, Alton Park in 72, and then in the BRM in 73. Pretty evil car by then, the BRM. And he was super quick. I've always felt Niki was really quick. And I remember Carlos, who's very good on detail and watching detail and feeling detail in racing. And I remember Carlos, when he joined Ferrari in 76 and then throughout 77 as Niki's teammate, he said, you know, a lot of the year his challenge was to try to take the car out of the garage as neatly and smoothly as Niki Lauda. He said, I've almost got it, but I had to do a lot of practice at testing at Fiorano. It's just like the lowest possible revs out onto the pit lane with no jerk, everything absolutely perfect. But mind you, Carlos always said he did have the benefit of Kogi doing his fuel injection mixtures. No offense to Antonio Bellantani, who was doing Carlos's, but Carlos always reckoned there was nobody better than Kwogi to get the balance. And I think Nicky was right about that because he took Kwogi with him to Brabham, to Alpha. The only guy. Oh, he took Santa Gadini as well, didn't he? And Parmalat. So yeah, but Nicky was very good, and I noticed that actually when I drove. I only drove a road car with him once. No, I did a race with Nicky, didn't I? I did that race with him in Brazil. And he just sat next to me. I did the first stint of the race, and he was sitting next to me. And there we are, throwing the car around. And Nicky was, yeah, go, flat, brake, okay, move. He was good. But anyway, when I sat next to him when he was driving in Uruguay one year, he in an old VW. I mean, everything was just beautiful. The gear change, the clutch take up, everything was just as Carlos described. Very low revs everywhere. But he was a bit fragile. You know, maybe he broke his rib, didn't he? Just driving the car, just lateral G broke a rib. So I'm not sure what he got on with today's cars. But he was a bit like Fernando Alonso in the sense that he was very politically adept at how to run a team and put a team together when he was driving for it. I'm not saying he had the same skill when he was overseeing it as he did at Jaguar, and when he went back to Ferrari for a while as a consultant. That didn't really work out. But when he was driving, he knew how to get the good bits on the car and how to get the team sort of running around him. So yeah, great guy, a lot of respect for him, a lot of time. And when you think of what he did against Prost and how good Prost was at McLaren and how he actually won that championship in '84, amazing, really, by half a point. Incredible. Really, really good. And he didn't really get his act together until the French Grand Prix. And he just sort of, right, I got to work out how to beat him now, and I'm going to have to do that. And he did. All right, a couple more questions, and then I'm going to go and look after my voice. So this is when the stream went down. People saying, yeah, I'm leaving here. I'm blah, blah, blah. So there you go. But then it says you're back, I think. Sheriff of Zandvoort says, do you think Isaac Hadjar can be a problem for Max Verstappen if he joins Red Bull? Not in the way that if Lando or Oscar Piastri or Charles Leclerc or George Russell were joining, because Isaac's in a different stage of his career. But he'll certainly... he won't be a problem at all. But he'll be very near Max on occasions, I think. And he will learn from Max more than Perez ever learnt, more than Daniel ever learnt, more than Liam Lawson ever learnt, or Yuki Tsunoda's ever learnt. He will definitely learn from Max. And I think there will come a time when he won't be far away from Max because of that. It'll be the best thing Isaac Hadjar can have, would be Max Verstappen to learn from. And he's got a big enough brain to be able to learn from Max on that. And I don't think Max will mind imparting a lot of what he knows. And how, I mean, again, you know, it's not a question of talking about things. It's a question of Isaac asking the right questions at the right time. And by that I don't mean asking a question verbally. I mean it's following Max and listening to Max in a debrief and understanding the way Max dissects a practice session and faces the issues that the engineers are giving them, i.e., well, we can't make the turn in any better without destroying the rear. How Max then goes away and works out how to drive the car around those parameters. That's what I mean by asking the right questions. And if Isaac says, how does Max do that? And just watches and to some extent looks at what's going on, he will benefit from that for sure. He'll be an excellent number 2 for Max. Excellent number 2 for the team in general. And he'll do a very good job. But it won't be a point, there'll never be a point where Max thinks to himself, this guy's a problem. I don't think he'll ever get to that point because he's at a different stage of his career, as I say. James Hunt had the most charisma. This is Michael Payne. Yeah, well, you see, that is... I'm just going to try something else with lighting, and it's driving me absolutely mad. 1 second. that's any better. Let's see. A little bit, not a lot. It's weird, isn't it? I don't know why the lighting's so difficult tonight. James Hunt had charisma, says Michael Payne. Yeah, but he had personality and he had character. And that showed through in everything he did, out of the car, which we know, the James we know and love. Charisma is a different thing, I think. That's why it's a different word. So, a charisma, if I think about James's charisma, it would be the blend of this Wellington College educated junior Wimbledon standard tennis player who spoke the Queen's English with this Formula One driver that used to throw up before he got in the car through nerves. That, to me, if you blend all that, that's the charisma of James Hunt. Not the girlfriends and the bare feet and the vest and the, all the other stuff. But as I say, it's all subjective. It's completely subjective. It's based on the other drivers your understanding of the sport and what you expect from racing drivers anyway. I think that's the point. Bucky Nick. Hi, Peter. What does Lewis need to get his mojo back? Would sports psychology, heavy sim work, and home life change help? Well, as I've said many times, it's you can look at all those things and say, well, a little bit of this might help, a little bit of that might help. The reality is, Lewis Hamilton has not gone to Ferrari saying, wow, I got into some bad habits at Mercedes, having to drive that dog of a car with its bouncing and this and that. I'm going to spend the winter of 2024, 25 doing nothing other than redeveloping and honing my skill of short corners and driving the way I used to drive. And I'm going to do that in a road car. I'm going to do that in any way that you could think of doing it. And there are plenty of ways you can do that. He didn't do that. He went there thinking, wow, Ferrari, 7 times world champion. What a breath of fresh air. Red car, Italy, pasta. Lewis Hamilton, bigger than ever. Share price has gone up. And that's where he hasn't done the work he needed to do in order to recover from all the rubbish he was going through at Mercedes and delivering at Mercedes to some extent because he was getting blown away by George. And that's why it hasn't changed. Now, a sports psychologist isn't going to change that because I bet there are no sports psychologists out there that know the difference between long and short corners for a start, or can feel the difference in sensitivity required between the geometrical apex and a rotation point. Tell me a sports psychologist in Formula One that would know that. So that's one. Who else have we got? Heavy sim work. Well, you can't simulate dynamic weight on a sim. All those different dynamic weights going on. So forget about that. Home life change. Well, when he was driving beautifully in the old days, he was all over the place with his life away from the track, wasn't he? He was doing stuff in Hollywood, living in America, doing all that. Yeah, it cost him a few races, arguably even a championship one year against Nico, but he kind of got on top of that, and he built a very nice wall between the Lewis out of the car and the Lewis in the garage. So I don't think that's an issue for him. So the only issue is he didn't do what I just described, and nor did Freddie Vasseur, who didn't say to him, "This is what you need to do, Lewis. Be careful, because Charles Leclerc is the driver you were up until 2021, and right now the Lewis Hamilton that we have isn't the guy that could beat Charles Leclerc. You need to get your act into gear." I don't believe Fred Vasseur said that to him. And you would say, well, why would anybody say that to the great Lewis Hamilton? Well, I'm saying, well, not many people could, but if anybody can, it's Freddie Vasseur, because he knew Lewis when he was in Formula 3. That was the whole point of going to Ferrari, in my opinion, that he had Vasseur there to crack the whip and get him to focus on what he does so well and can still do so well. Now, whether in the August break he's finally decided that he has got to get going in terms of shorter corners, doing all the things that he used to be able to do incredibly well, breaking into the rotation point, extending the straights, looking for that lovely moment in the middle of change of direction when you can just get the car perfectly flat. All those things. I hope he has been doing it over the August break and hasn't been wasting time going on holiday somewhere, clearing his mind. We'll see at Zandvoort, I guess, won't we? Alpha 007, hi, welcome back. Hope everything's okay. Different circuits test different drivers and cars. Why do you usually rate circuits which test drivers and cars' ability to ride curbs, like Canada Imola, lower than circuits which have only standard corners? Do I do that? I'm not really conscious of curbs very much. I think it's probably one of my failings as somebody that tries to understand what's going on. I never really look or think that much about curbs, in that I just think some cars ride curbs better than others, but you shouldn't. I think what I really think is that, sorry, too many thinks there. What I really think is that a great driver should be able to do, or will do, a great lap, even if he's not using as much curb as, say, his teammate who's not quite as good at weight management as he is, or some of the other guys out there on the grid. I've always felt that hitting the curbs was so banal that I'm just not very interested in it. But you're saying that I rate circuits which test drivers and cars' ability to ride curbs. Well, I don't. I mean, I don't rate Zandvoort, this current spec Zandvoort, the last spec Zandvoort. I don't rate it as a particularly demanding, interesting circuit for drivers. It's probably quite a good circuit for racing, because even if you can't overtake, they're all going to be bunched together, safety cars, the whole thing. But I don't find it a very discerning circuit for drivers. But I don't think in terms of curbs. I just think if the McLaren is better over the curbs than, say, the Ferrari, I think Charles will make up for that on the slow corners. But I don't think he'll make up for the downforce difference between McLaren and Ferrari. That's what I think. So I don't know. There you go. M.A. Khan's super chat. Thank you very much, M.A. Khan. Very kind. What do you think of a Palou to Red Bull rumour? Well, I'd love to see Alex Palou in anything, let alone a Red Bull, because I think he's incredibly good. I've always felt that. I've always felt that ever since Campos ran him in GP3 or Formula 3. And I'm amazed. I've said this before. I think shame on Formula 1 that nobody's given him a break until now, because he's incredibly good. Short corners, sensitive, very, very supple. And in the same breath, I'd have to say I think Vesti's the same. He's never. I know he's been with Merck, and I know he does a brilliant job with the sim and all that. But there's so many good drivers out there that are not given opportunities at all. It's ridiculous. I was thinking of Vitaly, no, not Petrov. What's that guy? Markelov, the other day. I mean, he was a bit wild, wasn't he? Russian driver, but I mean, he was Artem Markelov, unbelievably quick and very good at overtaking. And not many people. I think he passed like 5 cars in the GP2 race at Abu Dhabi in his last year, in places where nobody ever overtakes. And nobody ever ran him in Formula 1 at all. Nah, not interested. I know he's Russian, but even then there was no interest really. He was on some sort of Renault thing, but they never really did anything. Hopeless. Easy G says, "Are you right? Am I right to be worried about the 26 regs?" Well, I'm worried about the active arrow, I have to say. I'm not a fan of playing around with adjustable wings. Never have been, never will be. I remember wings collapsing on stalks. DRS I find very contrived, and I don't like anyway because it can go wrong, as we saw with Jack Doohan, obviously at Suzuka this year, and Marcus Ericsson in the Sauber at Monza. Massive shunt as well when the DRS stayed open. And now we've got active arrow. I'm not into that at all. 26 regs also. I don't care about them being slower in a straight line. I don't know why everybody's so paranoid about that. But this whole push to pass thing, very contrived as well. Not my scene. I like proper motor racing with proper defense and proper attack, based on doing a better job than the guy in front of you, or the guy behind you for that matter. S. Sande, good evening, Peter. What's your favourite Max Verstappen race? Brazil 24. Yeah, it had to be one of the best, isn't it? He, yeah. I mean, there are too many, really. I mean, I thought his first win was lovely to watch for its rhythm and the way he was just. Everything was happening in slow motion for him then, and it was just like, whoa, this is a new era. And I think, you know, a lot of the things he's done. I mean, I loved some of his races when he wasn't super competitive at Red Bull, when he was driving around finishing 4th and 5th with the Renault engine, and he, you know, some of those drives and some of the manipulation of the car he was doing were just a joy to watch. So yeah, I'm going to have to stop in a second, guys. Have you heard any whispers about 26 engine development? Who hits jackpot? Who is washed? I don't think anybody in the engine department of any team knows that yet. They're all thinking, yeah, these numbers look quite good. That's going quite well. Maybe. We'll see. I don't think anybody's actually got it sussed yet. So there you go. So I'm going to make this last question. Oh no, 2 questions. James Wilson. Peter, have you seen the Max Verstappen video with Chris Harris? They lightly touch upon Verstappen and his views on driving. Yeah, I was a bit disappointed because I told a few people, I said, oh, you should see this. But I thought it was going to be quite, you know, very Max, a lot more Max than there was. A and B, they were actually going to get into, based on what people told me about the video, they're actually get into, so Max, what are you doing now, going into the corner now? What are you feeling through the brake pedal? What are you feeling through the throttle? I thought it was going to be that sort of stuff, but it wasn't really. So, you know, there we go on that one. And there's a good example, really, of teams today doing all their own media stuff and putting out stuff they think's entertaining. You know, it's a bit like the stuff McLaren have done when they've done Lando, when there's some golf stuff going on, and you don't actually get to see Lando hitting the ball and how well he can do it. It's all sort of jumping from here and a bit of putting there and head slapping there. I wish somebody would get on and do some proper stuff which you can actually understand. Orkan, this is the last question. What type of driver was James Hunt? How was he off track as well? Well, as I say, you know, I probably summed it up a little bit there. He was actually very nervous before a race, very nervous, and he was quite open about it. He was front-endy, definitely, not. Yeah, but he was different from the norm in that sense, and there were perhaps more. If you take somebody like Jean-Pierre Jarier or Tom Price, who were both really quick in James's era. In fact, Jarier, that race in that Dutch Grand Prix that he won in '75, was not far away from Nicky in the shadow. Really good drive, but James was all front end. You could say a bit like Nicky in that sense, but how would I say? I think Nicky probably was better on the things I was talking about. Engine, low revs, very, very good on slow corners. I think James's forte was more medium and high-speed corner. He was as good a high-speed corner driver as I've ever seen, I have to say. I mean, he was, and I'm talking turn 1 in Austria now, or Kops, Silverstone, or Schivlak, Zandvoort. He was unbelievably good. In McLaren M23, I think the M26, the front end was never as good as the 23 on those particularly stiff Cyborg Goodyears they had in '76. James was incredibly quick there. And yes, he was so good at the Nürburgring that year. I mean, we all remember it for Nicky, but James was unbelievably quick at the ring, '76. And he was very good. He kind of applied Wellington College rugby ethos to the way he ran his racing car, in terms of the engine, the brakes, getting the tyres warm, working with Alistair Caldwell. The way he did it was all very organised. Even though he looked quite disorganised as a person, you could say, you know, all the girlfriends and this and that, but he was very organised as a racing driver, in my opinion, and articulate, but not in a very complicated verbose way in which some drivers are and were quite articulate racing drivers who weren't brilliant, would often divide the corner up into too many segments and confuse engineers. The first third of the corner it's doing that, the second third. James would be, I've got understeer, get rid of the understeer and I'll be quick. It would be that sort of thing. And oh yeah, I've got the traction, that's all I need. Good, go for it. Come on, Teddy, up. And cerebral. Yeah. When he was out of the car in his peak, he would be playing backgammon with John Hogan or Niki Lauda. A great racing driver, but because he had that tension and he had that nervousness and that nausea, it was no surprise that his career was so short-lived, because he just didn't actually enjoy it that much. I think once he won the World Championship, he did a year or two, and he was quick still, very quick, but I don't think he was enjoying his racing driving. And it was obviously the fear of being hurt was one thing, but it was also just the tension of competition as well, that he gave everything to it. And he used to be, as I say, nauseous in that sense was for the start of the race, just the sheer competitive nature of it. It probably added to his thing. And I've got to say, Nigel, I don't want to give too many secrets away here, but Nigel used to be very nervous is the wrong word. There used to be a lot of tension with Nigel before a race as well, in a way that that the public never saw. And so it was with James. Tough on people, but he could read the fountainhead between practice sessions and talk to you about Ayn Rand versus William Faulkner. He was very literate, very intelligent, lovely guy who had a very sad end to his life with lots of stupid legal decisions made about his life with his divorces, and left him very little money. And he used to drive around in a little Austin A35 van, kept his budgerigars at home in Wimbledon, and he had his dog Oscar, who was a German Shepherd. James is very good at tennis, very good at golf, and I remember memorably going up to Turnberry one year, sadly owned by Trump now, I think, but I'm sure Trump doesn't know that there used to be a Formula One Grand Prix circuit at Turnberry. Do you think he knows that? And he's got a plaque. This is where Peter Whitehead raced, or whatever. I think Farina raced there. And anyway, getting back to the point, I went up to Turnberry, and it was Seve Ballesteros and Lee Trevino playing with James Hunt and Nigel Mansell, with Oscar the dog, following the foursome around, four ball around. And James, he told me beforehand, he said, Oscar's the only dog that is trained not to pant when I begin my backswing. It's true. As soon as James addressed the ball and began the backswing, Oscar stopped panting. It was amazing. And I remember Trevino laughing his head off when he saw that. And James drove up to that in his massively gas-guzzling, this is before the divorce, Mercedes 600 with Oscar. Oscar sitting in the passenger seat next to James and staying in dog-friendly hotels on the way. He was absolutely brilliant. And he had an African grey parrot called Humbert as well, I remember, who used to like reading the Financial Times. Not much left of it by the time he'd read it, of course, but like the pink pages, like the pinkin, he used to say. James. I know why Nicky loved him so much, because he was so funny. I mean, Nicky used to love Monty Python when Monty Python was huge. So you can imagine what he thought of James Hunt. So there you go. Anyway, thanks for letting me finish on that note. It's wonderful to think about James. In fact, I'm going to bring the picture up again of James winning the 75 Dutch Grand Prix in the Hesketh on the podium. Where is it? There you go. I was looking at the F1 website just before I came on, and they said, highlights of the Dutch Grand Prix. Have a look here at James Hunt, 75. And it was like 3 seconds blink and you missed it. It was just close up of him on the podium, which you can see there anyway. The only thing you don't see is the great Marcus Westerby of... I think that's actually Marcus in the blazer there, maybe. You can see Marcus Westerby of Moet Chandon when they put the Moet out. But Nicky looks cool there, doesn't he? That's what he looked like, obviously, before the accident. And you can see he's actually very happy there for James. And Clay Regazzoni, I mean, what a boy he was. Linear sport overalls Clay used to wear. Whereas I think Nicky was in maybe linear sport as well. And there's James. Wow. Winning for Hesketh. Astounding. Actually, just to finish on that, the full circle, we were talking about Climax engines and John Cooper to some extent, Charles and John Cooper and Jack Brabham. And there is a connection here. When John Cooper was a bit, he was the guy that wanted Charles Cooper to go motor racing post-war and pushed Charles into doing this weird rear-engine Formula 3 car which transformed the world, as it turned out. And one of the first times they ran it was in late, about 47, I think, before Silverstone was open. It was still a Ministry of Defence Air Force base. But John Cooper had heard that it was there. The word was out that it had some nice runways where they could run the car. So they went up. They took this Cooper up there. There's a bunch of them, friends and a couple of mechanics. They went up to Silverstone and were about to sort of run the rear-engine Cooper down one of the straights. And suddenly a MOD guy in uniform appeared and said, "What are you doing here? What are you doing here?" And anyway, they had to leave. They weren't allowed to be there. It was the Ministry of Defence property. So they went down to drown their sorrows to Toaster, the nearby town, to the pub to have lunch. And and they were talking about all this and how unfair it was and where were they going to test the car, because they needed to test the car before the Brighton Speed Trials that were coming up, or something really important like that. As an aside, John Cooper started the Brighton Speed Trials against another gentleman who'd built his own special, who was called Alec Issigonis. Imagine that. Alec Issigonis, the creator of the Mini, alongside John Cooper, who basically, with his father, created the Cooper version of the Mini further down the road. And there they were doing a Brighton Speed Trial together. Anyway, get back to the Toaster pub. They're talking about how unfair it is. And suddenly a gentleman comes over to them, and he was a gentleman with a capital G, and to say, "What's been going on here?" And they told him the story of being thrown out of Silverstone. He said, "Oh, I've got some land. You can come and use mine this afternoon." And they thought, "Wow, amazing. Okay, thank you." And they towed the car over to this guy's land and ran the car up and down. It was the original Lord Hesketh. It was Easton Neston where they ran that Cooper. The place where the Hesketh Formula 1 car was later run from, that won the Dutch Grand Prix in 75. What do you call that? I don't know. Connecting the dots, I guess. Anyway, thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to be back doing the 3 videos as normal. Friday, Saturday, Sunday for the Dutch Grand Prix. Could be wet all 3 days. Amazing. Big thanks to Jetcraft, to OEM Exclusive, to TrackNinja, and to REC Watches for their support. Wouldn't be doing this without their support, and indeed without your support either, your support being that of the viewer and listener, of course. So thank you so much for supporting this. Good to be back. See you very soon.